Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There is a profound, almost primitive terror associated with the deep wilderness. It is a landscape indifferent to human survival, a place where the margin of error is agonizingly thin. When people vanish into the snow-choked mountains, the elements usually write the final brutal chapter of their story, but occasionally, the wilderness leaves behind a puzzle so incomprehensible, so stubbornly resistant to logic, that the environment itself seems like a mere backdrop to a darker, more psychological mystery. Today, we dissect the anatomy of the American Dyatlov Pass. We will examine the baffling behavioral anomalies, the inexplicably abandoned vehicle on a remote mountain road, and the tragic, protracted deaths of 5 young men who fled from safety into the freezing unknown. To understand the sheer absurdity of their disappearance, we must first deeply understand who these men were. They were known affectionately in their community of Yuba City, California, as the Boys. Though they ranged in age from 24 to 32, they shared a bond forged through a local vocational program for adults with cognitive and psychiatric disabilities. The Gateway projects provided them with structure, friendship, and a sense of purpose. They were not hardened outdoorsmen. They were not thrill seekers. They were vulnerable, highly dependent on their families, and strictly creatures of habit. The oldest of the group was 32-year-old Ted Weiher. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds, Ted was a friendly giant. Despite his imposing physical stature, he had the cognitive development of a young child. He was known to spend hours standing at the edge of his yard, cheerfully waving at passing cars. He was intensely afraid of the dark and terrified of the cold. His grandmother, whom he lived with, was highly protective of him, and Ted lacked the most basic survival instincts or common sense. If his brother playfully told him to stop, Ted would freeze in place until given permission to move again. Bill Sterling, 29, was deeply religious and profoundly close to his mother. He spent much of his time reading the Bible and various encyclopedias, absorbing information but struggling to process the complexities of the adult world. He was gentle, easily influenced, and had an intense aversion to any disruption in his routine. His best friend was 24-year-old Jack Hoot. Jack was the youngest and most severely disabled of the group. He was incredibly shy, almost completely nonverbal with strangers, and possessed a pronounced stoop when he walked. He shadowed Bill Sterling everywhere, relying on him as a social anchor. Jack was fiercely protected by his family, and possessed an extreme fear of strangers and unfamiliar environments. Then there was Jack Madruga, 30 years old. Madruga was a high-functioning individual. He had served in the United States Army in the late 60s and early 70s, driving trucks. He had a mild intellectual disability, but he held a driver's license and was intensely proud of his car, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. Madruga was a careful driver, protective of his vehicle, and possessed a decent geographical knowledge of the Sacramento Valley. He was the designated driver for the group's outings, trusted by the other families to bring their boys home safely. The final member of the group, and the one whose background drastically differed from the rest, was 25-year-old Gary Mathias. Gary was not intellectually disabled. He was a veteran who had served in the military in West Germany. During his service, he developed a severe drug problem and was subsequently diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His discharge was psychiatric. Following his return to California, Gary had a turbulent history, including arrests for assault, periods of severe delusion, and involuntary commitments to state hospitals. However, by early 1978, Gary had stabilized. He was diligently taking his prescribed antipsychotic medications, stelazine and cogentin, and had not experienced a violent or psychotic episode in over 2 years. He worked at his stepfather's gardening business and had become integrated into the group through the Gateway program. Gary was the wild card, the only one with street smarts, military training, and a history of severe mental illness. Friday, February 24, 1978, was meant to be an evening of pure joy. The next morning, the Gateway Gators, the basketball team the 5 men played for, were scheduled to compete in a Special Olympics tournament in Sacramento. A win meant a free week in Los Angeles. The men had their uniforms laid out on their beds at home. They had talked of nothing else for weeks. But on Friday night, they wanted to watch a college basketball game. They piled into Madruga's Mercury Montego and drove 45 miles north from Yuba City to Chico, California, to watch the UC Davis team play Chico State. The game concluded around 10 in the evening. The men were seen leaving the gymnasium, elated by the game. They drove a short distance to Bears Market in downtown Chico. The store clerk remembered them clearly. They purchased 1 Hostess cherry pie, 1 Hostess lemon pie, a Snickers bar, a Marathon bar, 2 Pepsis, and a quart of milk. They walked out of the store into the crisp winter air, got back into the Montego, and drove away. The route home was simple. They just needed to take Highway 99 straight south back to Yuba City, a drive of roughly an hour. They never arrived. By morning, 5 families were frantic. The pristine basketball uniforms lay untouched. The men had vanished. Law enforcement initially treated it as a case of grown men deciding to take an impromptu trip, a frustratingly common assumption that delays critical early search efforts. But the families knew better. These men did not take impromptu trips. They did not miss meals. They certainly did not miss their basketball tournament. By Sunday, a massive search was underway along the Highway 99 corridor, but it yielded absolutely nothing. The first impossible piece of the puzzle fell into place on Tuesday, February 28th, 4 days after they disappeared. A park ranger traveling on a deeply rutted, unpaved logging route in the Plumas National Forest noticed an abandoned car. The location was staggeringly wrong. It was on the Oroville-Quincy Road, an isolated mountain track approximately 70 miles northeast of Chico. It was in the opposite direction of Yuba City. The elevation was over 4,000 feet. The snowline was thickening. The car was Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego. It was parked at a slight angle on the dirt road, resting in patches of snow. Immediately, investigators noted terrifying anomalies. The car was not broken down. It had a quarter tank of gas. The keys were gone. The undercarriage was completely free of mud or damage, despite traversing miles of treacherous, pothole-riddled mountain roads in the dark. This suggested the driver had navigated the brutal terrain with excruciating care, dodging every rock and rut. Madruga was fiercely protective of his car, but the idea of him driving it up this remote logging road in the dead of winter made no sense. Even more baffling was the predicament of the vehicle. The tires were spinning in a small patch of snow, but the car was by no means hopelessly stuck. Investigators later noted that 5 healthy men could have easily pushed the Montego out of the snowbank, yet they had abandoned it. One window was rolled down, exposing the interior to the freezing mountain air. Inside the cabin, investigators found the wrappers from the candy and pies purchased at Bears Market in Chico. They found neatly folded maps in the glove compartment. There was absolutely no sign of a struggle, no blood, no indication of foul play within the vehicle. Why would these 5 men, completely unequipped for winter weather, abandon a perfectly functional, sheltered vehicle to walk into the freezing darkness of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The sheer lunacy of leaving the car is the central anomaly of the case. They were wearing light jackets, low-top sneakers, and jeans. It was roughly 30 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The darkness in the forest canopy would have been absolute. Shortly after the car's discovery, a bizarre and deeply unsettling witness account emerged. A 55-year-old man named Joseph Shans came forward with a story that only deepened the mystery. Shans owned a cabin further up the Oroville-Quincy Road. On the afternoon of February 24th, hours before the boys even went to their basketball game, Shans was driving up the mountain road when his Volkswagen Beetle became stuck in the snow, roughly 100 yards up the road from where the Montego would later be found. While trying to dig his car out, Shans suffered a mild heart attack. Experiencing severe chest pains, he got back into his car, left the engine running with the heater on, and lay in the back seat, drifting in and out of consciousness. Around 11:30 that night, the exact time frame the Montego would have arrived in the area, Shans recalled waking up. He saw headlights pulling up behind him on the road. He looked out and saw a car parked in the snow. Desperate for help, Shans claimed he got out of his vehicle and began calling out. He stated he saw a group of men and a woman holding a baby, walking in the illumination of the headlights. He yelled for assistance, but the moment he spoke, the lights went out, and the voices stopped. The figures vanished into the darkness. Shans, terrified and weak, retreated to his car. Hours later, he claimed he saw a pickup truck pull up, briefly illuminate the scene, and then back away down the road. Again, his cries for help were ignored. Shans's account is a forensic nightmare. It introduces phantom characters, a woman and a baby, and an unidentified pickup truck. Investigators thoroughly vetted Shans. While they acknowledged he was in severe medical distress and likely experiencing altered perceptions or hallucinations due to his heart condition, they firmly believed he was physically present at the scene that night. His timeline perfectly matched the estimated arrival of the boys' car. Did Shans hallucinate the woman and baby? Did he misinterpret the shifting shadows of the 5 men? Or was there someone else on that mountain road that night? Someone they were meeting, or someone they were fleeing? Severe winter storms hammered the Sierra Nevada throughout March, dumping feet of snow over the Plumas National Forest. The search for the men had to be suspended. The families agonized through the spring, clinging to the desperate, fading hope that perhaps the men had been kidnapped and were being held somewhere warm. The reality, which would remain hidden beneath the snowpack for months, was a nightmare of agonizing, slow attrition. On June 4, 1978, nearly 4 months after the men vanished, a group of motorcyclists was riding near a Forest Service trailer camp, roughly 19.4 miles further up the mountain from where the Montego had been abandoned. The area was deeply isolated, used primarily as a base camp for forestry workers during the summer months. One of the motorcyclists noticed a broken window on a large, heavy-duty trailer. A terrible odor emanated from inside. When authorities arrived and breached the trailer, they were met with a scene of profound horror and inexplicable tragedy. Lying on a bed inside was the body of Ted Weiher. He was wrapped tightly in 8 sheets from head to toe. His body was emaciated. He had lost nearly 100 pounds, half of his body weight. His feet were severely frostbitten to the point of gangrene. The coroner's report revealed a detail that shattered the families. Ted's beard showed between 8 to 13 weeks of growth. He had not died on the mountain that first night. He had survived inside that trailer for 2 to 3 months, slowly starving and freezing to death while his friends and family searched for him. The immediate surroundings inside the trailer presented a forensic paradox. that continues to baffle investigators to this day. Ted Weiher starved to death in a shelter surrounded by food. There was a storage shed adjacent to the trailer containing a year's supply of military rations, dehydrated food, and heavy winter clothing. Only one case of rations had been opened. Dozens of cans remained untouched. The men had consumed only a few cans of fruit and meat. They had not touched the heavy winter coats or the freeze-dried meals. Even more confounding was the issue of warmth. The trailer contained a heavy propane tank outside, connected to an internal heating system. All that was required to heat the trailer was to turn a single valve on the tank. It was never turned on. Inside, investigators found matches and paperbacks, which had been used to start small, brief fires, but only for the purpose of lighting reading material to use as toilet paper. They had not attempted to build a sustained fire for warmth, despite the freezing temperatures that eventually claimed Ted's life. Ted Weiher lacked common sense, but what about the others? Why did no one turn on the gas or open the rest of the food? The state of the trailer suggested the men believed they were trespassing, terrified of taking anything more than the absolute bare minimum to survive a few days. The psychological paralysis required to sit in a freezing trailer, slowly starving to death rather than breaking open a crate of military rations, speaks to a level of profound fear or cognitive breakdown that is difficult to fathom. The search immediately radiated outward from the trailer. The next day, investigators found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling on the path between the abandoned Montego and the trailer. They were located about halfway between the 2 points, roughly 11 miles from the car. Their bodies had been severely scavenged by wildlife, reducing them to scattered bones. However, the coroner determined that both had died of severe hypothermia. They had simply collapsed in the snow while attempting the brutal 19-mile trek to the trailer. 2 days later, the father of Jack Hoot, aiding in the search, found a pair of jeans and a backbone belonging to his son beneath a manzanita bush, just a couple of miles northeast of the trailer. Jack, too, had succumbed to the elements. His shoes were missing, a detail that would soon connect to the final, most terrifying mystery of the case. Inside the trailer where Ted Weiher died, investigators found a pair of leather shoes. They belonged to Ted. Beside them were a pair of low-top sneakers. They belonged to Gary Mathias. It became evident that at some point, Gary Mathias had taken Ted's heavier, warmer leather shoes. Leaving his own sneakers behind, it is believed that Gary, and perhaps Jack Hoot, survived the initial trek and made it to the trailer with Ted. They may have stayed with him, feeding him the few opened rations until he passed away, or until they realized no help was coming. At that point, Gary Mathias put on Ted's shoes and walked out into the wilderness. He has never been seen again. No trace of Gary, his clothing, or his remains has ever been located in the Plumas National Forest. He simply vanished into the vastness of the Sierra Nevada. When we dissect the anatomy of this case, we are forced to confront a series of behaviors that entirely defy logical explanation. The central question remains, why did they turn up the mountain road in the first place? Jack Madruga knew the route back to Yuba City. He was a capable driver. Highway 99 was a straight, well-shot south. To end up on the Oroville-Quincy Road required a deliberate turn away from their home, navigating through unfamiliar territory and increasing elevation. One theory posits a simple wrong turn. Perhaps they missed the highway entrance in Chico and became disoriented. But this fails to account for the duration of the drive. The logging road was unpaved, deeply rutted, and covered in snow. Madruga would have had to drive carefully for nearly 2 hours up a treacherous incline, feeling the temperature drop before finally stopping, Even if they were lost, logic dictates turning around at the first sign of snow, not pushing forward into the wilderness. This brings us to the theory of a terrifying encounter. Did something happen in Chico after they left Bear's Market? Did someone follow them? The boys were easily frightened and known to avoid conflict. If they felt threatened by an aggressive driver or an altercation, they might have panicked and driven blindly to escape, turning off the main roads and fleeing up the mountain. This theory aligns with their abandonment of the perfectly functional car. If they believed they were being pursued, the car would no longer represent safety. It would represent a trap. They might have fled into the woods to hide. However, this theory must account for the 19-mile hike through deep snow in complete darkness. It is an excruciating physical feat. To walk that distance uphill in light clothing requires an immense, sustained motivation. Pure terror could provide that motivation, pushing them past the limits of their physical endurance until Madruga and Sterling collapsed. But terror of what? Joseph Sean's claim to hear voices and see a pickup truck. Was there a confrontation on that dark road? The most psychologically complex theory centers on Gary Mathias. Gary was the only member of the group with street smarts, military experience, and a history of severe psychiatric illness. He also had friends in the town of Forbestown, which was roughly in the direction of the mountain road, though significantly lower in elevation. Did Gary convince Madruga to take a detour to visit these friends? Did a disagreement occur, or did Gary experience a sudden onset of his schizophrenia? Gary had been stable for 2 years, but he had been without his medication, stelazine and cogentin, for several days by the time they reached the trailer. While he was medicated on the night of the disappearance, the stress of being lost, the cold and the darkness could have triggered a relapse. If Gary began to experience delusions or paranoia, his military background might have compelled him to take charge of the group. The other men, highly compliant and easily led, might have followed his instructions implicitly. If Gary believed they were in a combat scenario, or being hunted by an unseen enemy, it explains why they abandoned the car and why they engaged in a grueling march. It also explains the agonizing scene inside the trailer. If Gary, Indiana, a delusional state, dictated that they could not open the rations for fear of being poisoned, or could not start a fire for fear of signaling their position to an enemy, the highly compliant Ted Weiher would have obeyed those commands to his grave. This theory paints a tragic picture of the men being led to their deaths, not by a malicious outsider, but by the fractured mind of their friend, whom they trusted implicitly. Yet, even this theory struggles to explain Gary's ultimate disappearance. If he survived long enough to take Ted's shoes, why did he leave the relative shelter of the trailer? Did he set out to find help, only to succumb to the elements further out in the forest, or did his delusions drive him deeper into the wilderness, where his remains lie hidden beneath decades of forest growth? The anatomy of the American Dyatlov Pass is constructed from a framework of impossible choices. It is a case where the physical evidence, the car, the tracks, the trailer, only deepens the psychological mystery. We are left to reconstruct the mental state of 5 men who were deeply vulnerable, thrust into an extreme survival situation for which they were entirely unprepared. The tragedy is amplified by the sheer volume of time that passed. Ted Weiher's agonizing 2 to 3 month survival inside that trailer is a testament to the endurance of the human body, but also to the devastating paralysis of fear and cognitive limitation. Law enforcement eventually closed the case, ruling the deaths accidental due to exposure and hypothermia. But for the families in Yuba City, there was no closure. They were left with an agonizing void. forced to imagine the final terrifying hours of their sons and brothers on that dark mountain road. The Gateway Gators never played in their tournament. Their uniforms remained perfectly folded on their beds, a heartbreaking symbol of an ordinary life violently interrupted by an extraordinary mystery. The case of the Yuba County Five remains one of the most baffling disappearances in modern history, because it forces us to look past the forensic evidence and peer into the fractured, terrified minds of the victims. It requires us to understand that survival is not solely a matter of physical resources, but of cognitive resilience and the ability to process reality. When the mind fails to interpret danger correctly, a perfectly functional car becomes a trap, a trailer full of food becomes a starvation chamber, and a dark mountain road becomes a path to oblivion. In dissecting the anatomy of this tragedy, we realize the most terrifying wilderness they encountered was not the freezing Sierra Nevada, but the impenetrable darkness of their own profound disorientation. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.